Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Super-Fanta-Fi. This being a show where we talk about TV shows of the supernatural, fantasy, and or science fictional genre. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episode of SurrealEstates. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. First and foremost, Melanie Scrofano directed this episode. I knew she was in one episode, but I didn't know she also directed one. I was like, oh, that's cool. I don't think she directed the one she was in, but I definitely noticed her name in the directing spot. This one, I was like, oh, that's pretty dope. I'm curious. I have to look into it. I'm curious if she directed any one on her Earp episodes. I mean, because usually that happens, or like stars of like certain shows, like when a show goes on for a while, they get the opportunities to like direct an episode or two. So it's always interesting when you see that get to happen. Regardless, tangents and all that aside, this was a really interesting and very like sad episode in many different regards. Because I mean, first and foremost, like we're starting off with like, well, Phil and August dealing with this ghost, Russell. They're hiding from him. And I love that, like, Phil was talking mad crap about the ghost and then just kind of like, oh, like, kind of stuck in the house with them. The house that they're obviously trying to sell. And I love that it's kind of against the clock because they're trying to, like, get rid of this thing last minute before they have to present it to, like, because a recording artist named Damon is going to use it to be his new place where he, like, records and everything. And obviously they're trying to, like, Susan and Luke are pitching this to Tessa, kind of like the person who handles all that stuff for him, as well as his brother Zeke. So it's like, right, let's stop by the house. They do, but it seems like everything's been cleared, but Luke sees a slinky come down the stairs, and I thought it was interesting because it's like, right, it wasn't just Russell that was here, because Russell was kind of the angry spirit of like, he hated everyone, and it was like his great-grandniece or something like that took over the place, got ownership of it when he died. But it turns out Russell wasn't the only spirit there. There's actually potentially a younger spirit too. So to find out more about it, they have to talk to the previous owners, which is a complicated thing for Phil because the previous owner was the Catholic diocese. So because this place used to not only have like previous owners, like the church at certain points owned it, the property. So he ends up confronting a sister who knows him all too well. What was it? Mary Ellen. And obviously she's talking about the fact is like, oh, you can't just kind of stop here whenever you want to. And he's like, oh, aren't you guys open 24/7? He's like, right, that's Denny's, being super snide and making remarks. But the moment he starts asking about this house and wanting to look at the records, she immediately shuts him down about it. She's like, no. And then he meets another sister, Yasmin, who is kind of like, oh, I've heard about your last date. It basically, what was it, during like an Easter, was it service or something like that? He ended up being drunk, and that's kind of like how he kind of went on a kind of a bad note. And she's like, I heard you were drunk. He was like, yes. He's like, gay and drunk. Now I'm gay and sober. And that Yasmin's expression, she was laughing at first, kind of thinking like, oh, like, can't believe you get in so much trouble. But then like, she's like, oh, kind of realizing. And it, it's something that they have to, it's a complicated thing of like, there's a lot of, and I think this episode, it does an interesting thing because it kind of does like the show Evil does. Like, yeah, let's not forget the church has got some very dark, like, skeletons in their closet. And so hearing that, Yasmin kind of was like, oh, like, it's kind of sad to know, like, right, you being gay was kind of like a major, it shouldn't have been, but it was a major issue. And so obviously there's the conversations about her. It's like, right, you focus on all the like negative stuff about how the church runs things, because basically the house, its name comes from like the patron saint of unwed mothers or prostitutes or something like that. And it's like, right, that's how the church viewed mothers who weren't wed back in the day, which even Jasmine's like, yeah, there's a lot of stuff in our past that we're not too bad, but she's like, but look at the good that we do. It's like, education, feeding the hungry, as well as like, taking care of the ill. And then for Phil, it's like, but isn't that kind of expected? It's almost like you're doing it's not like you're doing above and beyond. It's like you're doing what's kind of expected of the church. Like it is like you're almost basically doing the bare minimum, just a standard thing that is expected of the church. And so I forgot what was he mentioned something afterwards that Yasmin didn't really have a response for, but he does admit later on when he's talking to that picture of Jesus, it's like, oh yeah, we haven't really talked in a while. He's like, hey, I'm just here to do the work. But he goes on this whole conversation, which I thought was kind of interesting, where he kind of talked about, at one point he's like, I went to that church on it was like third. Where was it? I was like, I mean, obviously, I don't even know why I'm asking you, but he had talked about basically there was a case that he worked on that was pretty rough, where it was like people were seeing a girl in a ragged like dress sitting in a corner in a chair alone. And that case ended up being pretty rough for him. He's kind of in a dark place, and he talked about walking by a church and like hearing like a certain song playing, and he went into the pews of that church, and he's like, yeah, I'm surprised I didn't get like an electric shock the moment I touched the door handle, but it's like sitting there, the music washing over him, it took him back to that moment. It's like he was even thinking, he was like, thank you for not taking, like, you could have taken that away from me, but you did, like, you made that music still mean something to me. Like, that feeling wasn't lost. Like, it kind of took me back a little bit. It actually helped him. It made him feel better. And I thought that was kind of like this beautiful, sad sentiment, because he ends up talking about it later on with his husband. Like, he's like, despite all the complications, despite the church's complications with him, it's like he still misses it. He misses like knowing that the thought of there being this loving, powerful person that has like your life planned out for you, but he misses that, which I love that his husband's kind of joking, like, oh, so you don't miss God as much as you don't need God. You mean something as much as Lin-Manuel Miranda. And then Phil just kind of turns and looks at him. He's like, don't you have a roof you need to be falling off of? I'm like, I love that. That's where his husband's mind went. But that in itself is a big part of this episode. Is like kind of like that's what complicates things for Phil too, because it's like, yes, he loves the church and kind of what it represents, but it doesn't always represent good. That the church does have its shady side, because they end up finding out, because Damon, which we'll kind of get to those side of things later, ended up seeing a little boy and going through the records. The place wasn't just an orphanage. It was a place where women or girls who were pregnant could go there and like have their babies and without the judgmental eyes of just the time frame. So, especially back in those days. So the moment the children, like 24 hours after the children were born, they'd be set up for adoption, and the mother and children would never see each other again. So it's a very sad place, just kind of because it's not like, oh, the place was born out of goodness of yes, they had the best of intentions, but that kind of doesn't matter when it's just kind of like, right, it was to hide away like these women who were gotten pregnant, like, one kind of out of wedlock. And it's like, in those times, you would have been looked at as a whore, like, oh, you're permissive, like, oh, how dare you get pregnant and out of wedlock. So it's like not being a married woman, like all of that. So it's like to protect themselves from the ridicule and the judgmental eyes of other people, as well as like the ridicule they get from their family, but also their family would receive. Like, it just be like, oh, almost be like pretending like none of it happened by dropping, like, having the baby there and everything. So it's actually a very sad element to it. And even to the point, like, even partway through the discussion, Phil was like, yeah, because at the end of the day, going there and staying there to have the baby and everything, you'd have to pay money to the church. And then later on, he's like, right, but also for, like, the adoption and stuff like that, the fees would go back, and he says sponsor, because he doesn't even want to just say the name of the church, but it's like it would go back to the sponsor of it also. Kind of the sad reality of it, because the little boy in particular, which we later on find his name is out as George. He had died in like 1970, because they went from the picture of 1969 to 1970, and he wasn't in a 1970 picture. So, once again, kind of at the same time all this is happening, obviously Damon comes to the place. Sarah is really good at what she does, so she kind of laid the groundwork to make sure that everything is right, meeting up to like Damon's expectations and stuff. I even love that whole thing between her and Tessa, where Tessa was like, it's like, yeah, everything is like the lightings are set up to the app. All you have to do is download. She's like, already downloaded. I just wanted to make sure. She was like, I knew you would already have it downloaded. Well, she's like, I knew you knew. And Zeke's almost like, really? Like, what is that? Which immediately can also tell there was immediately some like Zeke and Samantha like flares kind of going back and forth. Did I say Samantha or did I say Susan? I think I said Samantha. Actually, that's so crazy. I do that sometimes. Like, I go with Laura on autopilot sometimes. But like Susan and Zeke, because like I said, I strongly think I did say Samantha. Whatever the case may be. But there were definitely sparks flying in that regard. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But the real interesting thing is, like, the boy in particular, George, reached out to Luke first, but then he started really connecting with Damon. Initially, Damon was kind of freaked out by the place because while he was recording his music, doing his thing, like, the little boy was kind of messing with him because he wanted to play. I mean, he's a little boy, obviously. And obviously, they were able to convince him to stay. And I love it. He's like, I love, like, Luke's really good at it. He's like, hey, you know, when you're going on stage with a Stradivarius, like, you need to, like, tune it, right? Well, you're the Stradivarius, and, like, you know, let us tune the house to fit you. And he's like, all right, I am a Strat. Like, it is, like, it's actually really, like, it shows you how good Luke is at his job. But it turns out, like, there's these little green army men that pop up all over the place. It's so interesting, too, like, how they kind of represent it. Like, especially you can tell, like, the little boy George had issue with Tessa because she was like a fuddy-duddy. She was like very serious about everything. So like at one point she accidentally kicks and kind of steps over one. And she kind of like throws it like in a trash or a sink or something. And just she's very disrespectful. That's why the kid later on when she wakes up the next day has like her entire room with all the army men pointing their weapons at her. You know, so that's because it's interesting because like the only one who didn't have any experience, because I guess, like, he didn't really connect with Z, because, like, he wanted to play with Damon, but, like, Tara was kind of like the, not Tara, Tessa was the one that was kind of like I said, she was the one that was no fun, so, because Damon started actually feeling and vibing it, like, at points during it, George started making noise, and he's like, oh, like, he started using that in the music. He actually referenced it, and it is interesting because a lot of, like, the stuff that George was doing actually resonated with Damon. He kind of was, like, a lot more accepting of it than everyone else was. The Green Army Man, he's like, it reminded him of his uncle, Franco, who wanted him to go into the army, saying that basically his music wouldn't get anywhere. And so for him, it's like, right, I think my music success is my way of showing Uncle Franco up, but I think, you know, where he is, he's smiling and being proud of me. Then, like, the fire truck thing is because, or fire truck / ambulance thing was all about, for him, he's like, right, remember when I fell and busted my head, and it's like, you know, ambulance came and, like, saved my life. So, like, for him, it's all, like, all these parallels, like, that George is kind of doing just for fun. Like, Damon found a meaning in them and they kind of connected. That wasn't on purpose, but it is interesting that he found meaning in them like that, because I feel like that's never really, I mean, once again, these house experiences are so very different, because, I mean, and that's kind of something that ends up being a conversation between Zeke and Susan about the whole situation of, like, you know, it's like, right, every house is very unique. It's like, you know, comparing, like, you know, it's like, instead of, you know, when you just say, like, hip-hop is very, like, you use it's a very broad term. There are very different types of hip-hop. It's like comparing one to another, you know, so I thought that was interesting. But she was also saying, like, you know, from a retailer standpoint of, like, you know, this situation of, like, not realtor, situation of, you know, comparing this house to that house. So it's just, you know, it's just interesting that the show also reflects that too, because these are very different ghostly house situations. So, like, you know, every house is like its own has its own fingerprint, its own style, its own feel, its own vibe, to its own history, to be exact. So I thought that was just kind of fascinating how that kind of ultimately ended up flowing together. But initially, like, Damon, who was, like, really into it, like, partway through it, like, George covered his eyes so he could have gotten into a car accident, which is like, oh, you know, but it's like, right, if you leave, it might follow you. And it's like, for real? And he's like, yeah, but the fact is that, at the end of the day, it's like, you've connected with it, because, like, this, like, you know, the child, when you're a child, like, the world is, like, infinite possibilities, your imagination, like, that child, like, creativity. It's like, Damon, you connected with that, you know, in this, like, whatever is in this house, like, you connected with it on that level. And that's also the thing too, like, it did reach out to Luke, but they were like, why is it reaching out to Damon? Like, is it because you know, is it like trying to feel like a big brother vibe going on? Like, why is it kind of latching on to him? But then they're like, you know, what does this little boy want? And then you have Luke answering his mother, what any little boy wants, their mom. And I was like, that's it, very, like, sad and, you know, / sweet sentiment. So Phil goes back and talks to Sister Mary Ellen and kind of shows the photos, because for her, she talks about, like, well, let's talk about a word, pride. Pride, you who believe that the church's, God, what was it? Basically, its issues, your parish's issues weren't big enough that you thought you were bigger than something bigger. As yes, pride. And he's like, yes. All right, let's say that. Okay, just say that. Fair enough. But we could have potentially, me and the church could have potentially worked it out if the church didn't have so much an issue with who I was. who I am, you know, and like Sister Mariella didn't really have much to kind of say on that front, but it's like, right, let's get down to business. And he asked about, you know, for her, it's like, right, it was a different time. We were doing something great for these women. It's kind of like, shouldn't our good-natured sentiments be enough? But for Phil, it's like, no, it's not. Like, it doesn't matter what your intentions were. The after effect is like, you built this place. And it's like, you know, George, she said, like, he was a kid who never wanted to, never caused any problems until, like, he wanted to play. And obviously, nuns aren't built, definitely, especially at that time, but in general, aren't built to be the nurturing, kind of like huggy, feel, play with you type. Like, they're not built for that. You know, the role that a mother should feel. And it turns out, like, his mom, Helen, died. She was actually getting a good job, and she was actually going to come back and get him and bring him home with her, but an accident happened and she died, you know. So George is just, you know, lashing out, wanting someone to play with him. He's looking for his mom, and he locked Damon in the studio, and then everyone came into the room as, you know, as Luke kind of breaks it down and kind of talks to him. And I thought it was this nice moment, you know, this very, like, sad, heartbreaking moment of him talking to George, being like, I'm sorry, I'm going to tell you, I know what you're looking for. You're looking for your mom. Got some bad news. Your mom, she died, you know, and it's just kind of like basically bringing up how the fact is you don't always get what we want in this world. But it's like, but your mom loved you a lot. She was coming. She really, really wanted you. She was coming back for you. And so basically he's like, I get, you know, you want, you know, but, you know, close your eyes. I just need you to go to sleep. And then when you kind of open your eyes, there'll be a bright light. Walk towards it. You'll be there with your mom and plenty of other kids that you can play with. He's like, I just need you to close your eyes. And he's saying that. Luke is like crying, and just like everyone else is just in the room, silent, looking at this whole thing play out. And, you know, it's a heartbreaking thing of like, right, there's no like happy ending. Like, the silver lining is that maybe he's able to find his mom in the afterlife, that he's able to move on, and that he has other kids to play with. But just the history of that place, you know, it's heartbreaking. And I think maybe like some form of that will continue in the music that Damon was making, like how it kind of resonated with him in some shape or form. But obviously what this meant for Luke, you know, it's like, it made him think of his mom and his circumstances, because it's like, right, a boy's mother who actually wanted him and ended up dying. But then it started making him think, like, my mom said she didn't want me. Like, why did she leave? Was it because of me? Because Phil does say, like, Sister Mariella ended up lighting a candle not only for George and his mom, but for all the moms and children. Because it's like, there weren't, like, it was a few moms and a few children, because there weren't a lot of children at that place, like, all at once. So while he's bowling with his dad, he's just asking his dad, he's like, you know what? Why did mom leave? And he's like, what? He's like, was it me? Was it you? He's like, I'm thinking it's me. He just says us. And he's like, you know, if you want to know, you have to ask her herself. He's like, I did. And he's like, you wouldn't even know if you did. He's like, yeah, but I found the snapshot photos from the hospital. He's like, how did you? He's like, dead. You were dead. Like, he's like, but he quickly tries to deflect with humor, and it's a self-defense mechanism. And he's like, you know, if you found some magazines, you know, I was lonely. He's like, and that's what you're going to do? You're going to joke your way out of this? He's like, what can I say to kind of like alleviate some of the tension in this? And like Luke walks away. And the thing is, like, you see that look on his dad's face, like, even with the lights out, it's like, why did his, like, what is his dad afraid of? Like, what was his mom running from? Like, once again, my thought was that his mom's circumstances are like his, that whatever he's got, maybe his mom had it on a grander scale, and that maybe she left because she thought she was doing things better for them. Like, it's like, right, you'd be better off. Because I still believe that all that stuff his mom said to him was terrible stuff just to push him away so he wouldn't come back. Because I think there's something there. Because we might be dealing with almost like a, you know, speaking of Winona Earp, maybe there's kind of something similar to Waverly, spoilers, that there's kind of a whole, like, oh, there's something following you thing. And maybe something's been with Luke his entire life, or maybe it's like something connected to their family, maybe her specific side of the family, whether it be these powers of like why Luke can, you know, see ghosts and interact with them the way he does. Maybe there's something like that stems from his mom, and that maybe it has something to do with their family, and she tried to protect him from it, and that very thing is still active. And so she's trying to keep him away, because the closer he gets to all of this, the more likely he is to get swallowed up. But kind of like, I'm wondering, like, it's not a one-for-one. I'm surprised I never immediately went to this, like, The Frighteners. God, that's such a good movie. I'm going to rewatch that movie probably for Halloween or something. I have not watched that movie in years. I need to try and track it down and see if it's on any streamings or is it just, like, digital, like home DVD, Blu-ray type of thing. Whatever the case may be. Like, I'm wondering, like, that's a little bit of a different circumstance as the whole Frighteners thing, but I'm wondering if it's something of that nature where there's something, like, darker at play that she's trying to protect them from. I legitimately believe that, and maybe even his dad doesn't have the full story, but he has enough of the story that he doesn't want to tell Luke because maybe it makes him come off a little like maybe he did some stuff that kind of pushed her away. Like maybe it wasn't just Luke. Like maybe their marriage wasn't what he whatever the case may be. Luke's like, I always asked you questions and you would dodge it. And even in the afterlife, you're still dodging it. So I'm curious what's going on in that regard. So I'm very interested to see where all of this ultimately ends up taking us going forward into the next episode. Little by little, we're kind of creeping towards, because now, like, Luke definitely knows his dad knows something and he's just deflecting. So, like I said, we'll see how it plays out. But really, that's all I want to talk about. Until the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.